On a fateful night in 1963, one event would prove to leave a terrible mark on a small American town. And it all happened on the last night of October. For some unexplained reason, a seemingly normal boy took up a weapon and committed a terrible crime in his own house. Just before his parents arrived on the scene, and a blank stare was given to the audience, leaving an ominous impression that speaks volumes of the kind of movie you're about to witness. Now look, monster movies and horror were a pretty big staple of 20th century culture. Starting off the 1900s with popular renditions of classic archetypal characters of evil like Universal's own Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, and Wolfman, all seeing big success, before eventually getting parodied in Abbott and Costello crossovers. The end of the century was just as prominent, with characters like Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, and Ghostface all becoming icons in their own ways. But before any of those guys were on the scene, a little independent movie from a director that would eventually blow up in Hollywood took the world by storm. This movie being the real beginning of what would become known as the slasher genre, which started off that reign of 80s and 90s icons that we're all familiar with today. And the way it did that was by boiling every scary idea down to a very simple premise. Does evil exist? And what are we going to do about it? What's going on, guys? Hope you're all doing well. Now for today's video, I'm not gonna lie, it took me a while. I haven't seen Halloween in a long time, but watching it this time around, I gotta give a shout out to the MVP of the whole series, Dr. Sam Loomis. Dr. Loomis, you cannot stop him. He is unstoppable. He's in all these movies, just like Michael. He's always hot on his trail. He reminds me of, I've been doing a lot of theological research lately, and to quote Jesus' brother Jude, "Be merciful to those who show doubt, save others by snatching them from the fire, to others show mercy mixed with fear, hating even the clothing stained by corrupted flesh." Doc Loomis, man, greatest character of any horror series by far, as far as like hunting down the bad guy goes. But anyways.
Don't underestimate it.
Don't you think we could refer to it as him?
Halloween is a 1978 horror film directed by John Carpenter. It stars Jamie Lee Curtis, Donald Pleasance, and Nick Castle in a story about a crazed lunatic that escapes from an insane asylum and goes on a rampage through a small town. Or is it? You see, one of the things that made Halloween so interesting was the real premise behind the film, which built its story around something very, very basic.
Just try to understand what we're dealing with here. Don't underestimate it.
Donald Pleasance, who I'll always remember as Blofeld in 1967's You Only Live Twice,
"It won't be the nicotine that kills you, Mr. Bond,"
gives his excellent performance as a psychiatrist who has watched that boy that committed that terrible crime from 1963 for 15 years. Now, in 1978, he's escaped and returned home, with our only real explanation as to what we're up against being a testimony from the man that watched him for 15 years. And his diagnosis is not good.
Man wouldn't do that. This isn't a man.
Halloween tells the story of Jamie Lee Curtis' character Laurie Strode, and the pretty interesting differences that she has with her group of friends. Unlike every other character on the screen, Laurie is a pretty innocent and even intelligent girl. She doesn't get into trouble much, focuses on her classes, and even volunteers babysitting, while all of her friends go out and party with each other, even when they're also supposed to be looking out for people younger than themselves. Laurie would become the archetypal good girl character. She doesn't engage in promiscuity, she takes care of the people around her, and she's on top of her game in class, even giving a pretty memorable engagement in a seemingly meaningless scene where the teacher asks her about fate and whether or not it could be avoided, all while the villain of the movie looks on from outside.
Samuel's view of fate differ from that of Cosmo.
So who is this bad guy the movie's all about? Michael Myers is a boy that for whatever reason just became something else. No explanation into how it happened is given in the actual movie, and from Donald Pleasance's performance as Dr. Loomis, who is totally committed to the idea of there being good and evil in the world, that's all we've got, and it becomes a very interesting dive into what exactly that means for the people who commit horrible crimes, and really what it means on a more simplistic level to be evil. What is evil?
What was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
Upon rewatch, which in truth I hadn't seen this movie in like 5 years, I think one of the most interesting parts of the original Halloween is Michael Myers' lack of self at all in the movie. He doesn't really have a personality or even a motive for doing anything in Halloween. He used to be a normal person, but now he is just undeniably and in the most practical and basic sense pure evil. In fact, he starts giving me major Mark 9:17 vibes right off the bat. Michael doesn't really have much to explain to the audience in the first film of the series, but he starts to stalk a few people in Haddonfield, and without anyone really knowing why or what the whole deal is, except for the fact that he's a murderer. The movie gives off a kind of creepy, and I'd even go as far to say it's got this unexplainable warning sort of a feel. Like you don't know what kind of thing this guy is, but as humans, we also do not like being around it. All you really get out of Michael in the film is very deep breathing whenever he's watching somebody, and it's creepy. It's kind of strange. I have no doubt in my mind that the original intention for Michael Myers and his relation to evil was probably going to be something like a person overcome by a power or principality of darkness, ergo Ephesians 6:12, if you know what I mean. Even if it was only on a subconscious level back when America was more cognizant of Christian theology, but the movie isn't exactly straightforward with what Michael is or what's even going on with him. All we know is that Dr. Loomis, the man psychiatrist, knows. Like, he knows, man. He knows Michael is evil. He's had his own revelation from the experience, and like I said at the beginning of this video, it harkens back to the Universal monster movies of old, with the two taking on a kind of Count Dracula versus Dr. Van Helsing sort of dynamic. It's great. Loomis knows evil exists because he's seen it in Michael, and he will do whatever he has to make sure that this evil doesn't take anyone else's life that it comes across. There are even moments in the movie where the doctor mentions that when Michael leaves, the evil has left with him, almost like it's not necessarily the human part of the person responsible for it, but rather whatever evil is, and whatever has a hold of Michael as its host. And they say this very early on in the movie, leaving an impression of, oh, what exactly are we dealing with here?
Yes, I'm okay.
He's gone. He's gone from here. The evil is gone.
Deborah Hill, who helped Carpenter write the film, had this to say about the subject matter. The idea was that you couldn't kill evil, and that was how we came about the story. We went back to the old idea of Samhain, that Halloween was the night where all the souls are let out to wreak havoc on the living, and then came up with a sort of story about the most evil kid who ever lived. And when John came up with this fable of a town with a dark secret of someone who once lived there, and now that evil has come back, that's what made Halloween work. An idea they used for the film was that even if Michael Myers was gone, he's still everywhere at the same time. He is more than just human and maybe supernatural, and no one knows how he got that way. John Carpenter wanted to keep the audience guessing about all of that, which was better than explaining it all away, in their opinion. Now, the sequels, that's another topic for a different video, which we will cover down the line, don't you worry. But the initial 1978 movie, it's very basic. He's just evil, and the only thing that can stop him are good people that stand in its way. Of course, one by one, all of the friends of Laurie Strode engage in various levels of immorality, and they are all slowly done in by the evil once they engage in those activities, with only Laurie, the good girl, left to protect the children in the movie, and fend off the evil that has come to take Haddonfield.
Halloween, the night he came home.
Halloween tells a story that is at its very core just good guys versus bad guys, and it actually does a really good job of it, and it's for that reason that I think I've always had a soft spot for this movie compared to a lot of the other slasher entries out there. Don't get me wrong, during my horror marathon days, I would watch all the Friday the 13th, all the Nightmare on Elm Streets and Texas Chainsaw movies back to back to back to back, but if I'm being honest with myself, very few of those were anywhere near as good as the original Halloween, and I think that's because the movie really is just at its core the story of good versus evil in a lot of fun ways. And by the way, there's a lot of humor in this thing too, and personally I think it's got some of the most entertaining character dynamics when it comes to how the whole Halloween setting plays out in the plot.
All right, come on, where's my beer?
I wouldn't say that it's particularly aged too well. I mean, You see, for all Halloween's good, it's also undeniably silly at times, with the dialogue in particular being downright awful, if I'm being legitimately real with all of you. Look, I like this movie just as much as anyone else, but man, is it low-budget cheese at times. But that's still a pretty big deal when you consider how successful it became, and still is to this very day. There's little moments where Laurie will like look off camera when nobody else is in the room. She'll be like,
"Well, kiddo, I thought you outgrew superstition."
it's like, Laurie, please, are you crazy? Like, what's going on here? Why are you talking to yourself like that? Like you're in a movie? Like what's going on? Now look, no spoilers here. Absolutely none. I'm not going to spoil anything, but it all boils down to a climactic showdown between Dr. Loomis and Michael Myers that I think leaves the biggest impression on people when they first see it, because that ending is beyond spooky. And the way we see good versus evil go on is pretty memorable, man. The whole reveal of the level of strength and just power of Michael gives me some like clear chapter 5 of Mark vibes. And like I said, it really is all about the archetypal good person in Laurie Strode versus the powers of darkness in Michael, before Old Man Loomis steps in to even the score. This is the kind of movie that I think even if you're not a big fan, if you've seen it, you know exactly why it's talked about so much. With that being said, if you haven't seen this movie before, I would strongly urge you to at the very least understand why it made such a big name for itself when it came out, because Halloween is, for a lot of different reasons, an extremely interesting success on nearly every level. John Carpenter was a pretty fresh-faced director at the time, and this is the movie that would help make a name for himself later on down the line. While you may have already heard of some of his stuff like Assault on Precinct 13, it was this movie that would catapult him into major success with Kurt Russell for Escape from New York, and then there was Big Trouble Little China, and even having the WWF wrestler Rowdy Roddy Piper show up as the lead in They Live. I love They Live. I gotta talk about that someday. And also contributing to one of the coolest Kurt Russell movies ever made with the remake of The Thing. The original movie The Thing, by the way, is homage to in Halloween quite a bit actually. John really went all out in the movie with a budget of only around $300,000 and himself actually making the music, which is iconic in its own right. Everybody knows the score to Halloween. This was a massive hit, grossing like over $70 million. Jamie Lee Curtis' involvement, as well as something to talk about, by the way, because of her mother, Janet Leigh's success in Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 classic, Psycho. Halloween, in a lot of ways, is credited with taking the ideas from the first Norman Bates movie and forging ahead into a creation of the slasher genre as a whole, like I mentioned, and I think it's a totally fair assessment. Halloween would go on to spawn a long-running series of movies with a couple of reboots and even some remakes. I grew up loving most of them except for a select few, but it will be interesting to go through them all now that I'm older and have seen way more movies since then. Don't get it twisted, Halloween is not the greatest movie ever made, and it's probably not even the most iconic scary franchise to come out of the 70s, especially if you take into consideration a certain Steven Spielberg movie. But it is a fun time about good versus evil, and it became a massive hit all across the board. It's the perfect kind of movie to talk about, by the way, on Halloween. So, with that being said, guys, those are all just my own thoughts and opinions on the movie. What do you think about John Carpenter's 1978 classic, the original Halloween? What do you think about the themes? What do you think about the simplicity of the film comparatively to even the second movie, which we will talk about very soon, hopefully? But that's just my thoughts on the movie. Personally, the scariest scene is actually a jump scare between Dr. Loomis and the sheriff inside of the house. And my favorite moment actually has nothing to do with horror at all, and it's actually where somebody gets stuck in a door and a kid tattles on them. I love this movie. It is fun, and it's something that I think a lot of people can have fun talking about during this time of year. But hey, whatever your own thoughts, opinions, and beliefs happen to be around the whole iconography of John Carpenter's Halloween, I'd love to hear all about them in the comments down below.